Chapter 4 of Good Stories for Great Birthdays. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Good Stories for Great Birthdays by Francis Jenkins Olcott. Section 4, October the 30th, John Adams, the Son of Liberty. Second President of the United States. I have passed the Rubicon. Swim or sink, live or die, survive or perish with my country, is my unalterable determination. John Adams. Independence Day. I am apt to believe that it will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be commemorated as the day of deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, tender illuminations, from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward, for evermore. John Adams. John Adams was born in Braintree, or Quincy, Massachusetts, October the 30th, 1735. He was a member of the committee that framed the Declaration of Independence, and he signed the Declaration. He was Commissioner to France, 1778, and was Ambassador to England, 1785. He became the second President of the United States in 1796. He died on the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the 4th of July, 1826. A Son of Liberty. There was no loftier genius nor purer patriot during the struggle for independence than John Adams. He was born at Braintree, now part of Quincy, Massachusetts. He was descended from Henry Adams, who came to America during the reign of Charles I. On his mother's side, he was descended from John Alden, the Pilgrim Father who came over on the Mayflower. Thus, from both sides of his house, John Adams inherited staunch, fearless English blood and love of independence. He went to school in Braintree and later graduated from Harvard University, after which he studied law and was admitted to the bar. He married Abigail Smith of Weymouth, Massachusetts. They made their home in Boston. It is not possible here to tell all that John Adams did for America. He was an ardent patriot, a son of liberty, serving the country at the risk of his life. He was a delegate to the Continental Congress. He was a member of the committee appointed to frame the Declaration of Independence. He signed the Declaration. He was sent abroad on foreign missions. He was elected Vice President, and afterward called to be Second President of the United States. He lived to see his son, John Quincy Adams, made sixth President of the United States. He died on the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence at the great age of 91. Benson J. Lossing and other sources. The Adams Family. John Adams was not the only great American patriot in his family. His cousin, Samuel Adams, was a popular and fearless leader in the movement for independence. His activities were so feared by England that the government issued orders for his arrest and trial for high treason. Abigail Adams, John Adams's wife, was one of the noble American women who helped to win the war for independence. She kept her husband informed of the movements of the British around Boston, while he was attending the Continental Congress. She wrote him many patriotic letters, which are inspiring reading today. She signed some of them Portia, so that if they fell into the hands of the enemy, no one could tell who wrote them. She sent many of the letters to her husband by secret messengers. Their son, John Quincy Adams, became sixth President of the United States. His son, Charles Francis Adams, and the latter's two sons, Charles Francis and Henry Adams, served the country in important offices at home and abroad. They were historians and statesmen. John and Abigail Adams, their son and his two sons, kept diaries or wrote letters, memoirs, and biographies, which form a vivid and intimate story of many historical events dating from the War of Independence down nearly to our own time. Thus America has to thank the Adams family for historical records of great importance. Aid to the Sister Colony. It was a clear and frosty night, that night when the moonbeams fell on the tea thrown overboard by the Boston Tea Party. Paul Revere, all booted and spurred, was ready for a famous ride. Not the one to Lexington, but to Philadelphia this time. Soon he was off and away, galloping southward, spreading, as he rode along, the astonishing news that Boston town had at last defied King George. There were public rejoicings everywhere as the news was passed along. "This," said John Adams exultingly, "is the most magnificent movement of all. This destruction of the tea is so bold, so daring, so firm, intrepid, and inflexible. What measures will the ministry take in consequence of this? Will they resent it? Will they dare to resent it? Will they punish us? How?" John Adams did not have to wait long to find out how, for King George decided to punish the people of brave Boston town by starving them into submission. The Boston Port Bill was passed in England. A British fleet blockaded Boston harbor. No ship could go in or out. All supplies of food and fuel were cut off. The Boston folk suffered starvation, disease, and death, but they would not submit. Their misery became almost unendurable. Then it was that Massachusetts' sister colonies roused themselves. Samuel Adams of Boston sent a circular letter to each of the colonies asking for help. Food, fuel, and money came pouring in. All that summer, Boston, suffering, impoverished Boston, lay upon every loyal American heart. Each province, county, city, town, neighborhood sent its contribution. Windham, Connecticut, began the work of relief and sent in, with a cordial letter of applause and sympathy, a small flock of sheep. 258 sheep was Windham's notion of a small flock. New Jersey soon wrote that she would be glad to know which would be more acceptable to a suffering sister, cash or produce. "Cash," replied Boston, "is perfectly convenient." Massachusetts farmers supplied grain by the barrel and bushel. The Marblehead fishermen forwarded 224 quintals of good eating fish, 1 barrel and 3/4 of good olive oil, with money to boot. North Carolina promptly sent 2 slooploads of provisions. South Carolina's first gift was 100 casks of rice. And Baltimore town contributed 3,000 bushels of corn, 20 barrels of rye flour, 2 barrels of pork, and 20 barrels of bread. Virginia, there seemed to be no end to Virginia's gifts, and as the cool season approached, the farmers could be more liberal. Flocks of fat sheep and droves of oxen, together with hundreds of cords of wood, grain, and money in plenty, helped to relieve the suffering town. From New York City they came, and from Maryland, Maine, Connecticut, Rhode Island, from the 3 colonies on the Delaware, and from every little mountain town in New Hampshire and Vermont. As for Canada, from cold and remote Quebec came some wheat, and from Montreal 100 pounds sterling. The letters that accompanied the gifts, and the grateful answers from the Boston Committee, would fill a large volume. "Boston is suffering in the common cause," said her sister colonies. "If need be," said George Washington of Virginia, "I will raise 1,000 men, subsist them at my own expense, and march myself at their head for the relief of Boston." James Parton and Other Sources retold. A famous date. September the 5th, 1774. What a famous date in American history, and in the history of the whole world. On that day met for the first time the Continental Congress of America. From colony after colony, the delegates came riding into Philadelphia. George Washington of Virginia came with fiery Patrick Henry and Edmund Pendleton, one of Virginia's noblest sons. There came Caesar Rodney, burly and big, bold and bluff, with Thomas McKean and George Read, all from the 3 counties on the Delaware, and Roger Sherman, with Silas Deane of Connecticut, and John Jay and Livingston of New York. From Rhode Island, New Hampshire, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and South Carolina, the eager delegates came riding into the city of brotherly love. And, of course, John Adams and Samuel Adams, representing the suffering colony of Massachusetts Bay, were on hand when Congress opened. Among its first acts, the First Continental Congress sent a letter to General Gage, an address to the people of Great Britain, one to the people of Quebec, and a petition to King George, setting forth the grievances of the American colonists, the violation of their rights as free Englishmen, and asking for justice, but strongly urging a renewal of harmony and union between the colonies and the mother country, England. American histories tell how King George disregarded that petition. American histories also tell how William Pitt and other great English statesmen nobly defended America, as you may see if you read the story of William Pitt on page 93. What a glorious morning! When Paul Revere came galloping into Lexington, after warning the countryside that the British were coming to seize the powder and shot, he roused Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who were staying with friends. Paul Revere was come to warn them also, for the British General Gage had given orders for their arrest, and intended to send them to England to be tried for high treason. The British government was specially afraid of John Hancock, one of the most daring and active of the Boston patriots. The terrible desperado, he was called by that government. When he and Samuel Adams were escaping from Lexington and hurrying across some fields, Samuel Adams exclaimed, "Oh, what a glorious morning is this!" It was the morning of the Battle of Lexington, when the shot was fired that was heard round the world. After the Second Continental Congress opened, John Hancock was chosen to preside, while the Congress discussed how to defend the country. John to Samuel. New England was in arms. Lexington and Concord had been fought, and Boston was being besieged by the New England army. The Congress was discussing the defense of the whole country. There were some members who wished the Congress to take over the New England army and appoint a commander-in-chief. It was then that John Adams met his cousin Samuel Adams in the State House yard. This was the way John Adams tells it. Quote, "What shall we do to get Congress to adopt our army?" said Samuel Adams to John Adams. "I will tell you what I am determined to do," said John to Samuel. "I have taken pains enough to bring you to agree upon something, but you will not agree upon anything. And now I am determined to take my own way, let come what will come." "Well," said Samuel, "what is your scheme?" Said John to Samuel, "I will go to Congress this morning, and move that a day be appointed to take into consideration the adoption of the army before Boston, the appointment of a general and officers, and I will nominate Washington for commander-in-chief." End quote. A gentleman from Virginia. So it happened that John Adams rose in his seat and moved that the Congress should adopt the army of New England men and appoint a commander-in-chief, adding that he had in mind someone for that high command, a gentleman from Virginia who is among us, and very well known to all of us, a gentleman whose skill and experience as an officer, whose independent fortune, great talents, and excellent universal character would command the approbation of all America, and unite the cordial exertions of all the colonies better than any other person in the Union. Everyone knew whom John Adams meant, and George Washington, who was sitting near the door, was so overcome by modesty that he sprang up and darted into the library close by. But his modesty did not prevent his election. He was unanimously chosen commander-in-chief, while the army of New England men was adopted by Congress and named the Continental Army. Later, when Washington's appointment was announced in the Congress, he rose in his place and said most earnestly, "Since the Congress desire, I will enter upon the momentous duty and exert every power I possess in their service and for the support of the glorious cause. But I beg it may be remembered by every gentleman in the room that I this day declare, with the utmost sincerity, I do not think myself equal to the command I am honored with." But far-sighted John Adams was delighted. He was enthusiastic. "There is something charming to me in the conduct of Washington," he wrote to a friend, "a gentleman of one of the first fortunes upon the continent, leaving his delicious retirement, his family and friends, sacrificing his ease, and hazarding all in the cause of his country." His views are noble and disinterested. He declared, when he accepted the mighty trust, that he would lay before us an exact account of his expenses, and not accept a shilling pay. And to Abigail Adams, his wife, far off in Braintree, guarding her children from battle and murder and from sudden death, John Adams wrote: "I can now inform you that the Congress have made choice of the modest and virtuous, the amiable, generous, and brave George Washington, Esquire, to be General of the American Army." He wrote thus joyously on the 17th day of June, while on that very day Abigail Adams and little John Quincy Adams were standing on a hilltop watching Charlestown burn and fall into ashes. The Boy Who Became President. My head is much too fickle, my thoughts are running after birds' eggs, play, and trifles, till I get vexed with myself, wrote little John Quincy Adams, 9 years old, to his father, John Adams. Those were terrible times. Little John Quincy's thoughts were running after other things besides birds' eggs. He could hear the thunder of British cannon and the answering roar of American guns. There was fighting very near him. From a hilltop he could see the battle raging. He knew that some of the American boys who were fighting were from Braintree. Some time before, little John Quincy and his mother, Abigail Adams, had escaped from their home in Boston and had taken refuge in Braintree, which was not far away. Now they were living in constant terror for fear the British should attack Braintree. His father, John Adams, was not there to protect him. He was attending the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. On the 17th of June, 1775, the British cannonading began in the direction of Charlestown. John Quincy and his mother climbed the hill and watched the battle. With terror-stricken eyes, the boys saw Charlestown go up in flames and fall in ashes. And as for Abigail Adams, she trembled with fear lest the British should attack Braintree next. And then what would become of John Quincy and the other children? So John Quincy and his mother watched the famous battle of Bunker Hill, and while they were listening to the cannon and the guns, their beloved friend, Dr. Joseph Warren, the noble patriot who had joined the American forces as volunteer, fell mortally wounded. And when the news of his death reached Braintree, John Quincy burst into tears, for Dr. Warren had been the family physician, and had once saved the boy from having a broken finger amputated. And through those exciting times, John Quincy was a staunch boy patriot. When he was only 9 years old, he became his mother's postboy, riding to Boston and back, 11 or more miles each way, to get news for her. And every morning before he climbed out of bed, he did as his mother had taught him. After he had said the Lord's Prayer, he recited, "How sleep the brave who sink to rest, by all their country's wishes blessed, when spring with dewy fingers cold returns to deck their hallowed mould, she there shall dress a sweeter sod than fancy's feet have ever trod. By fairy hands their knell is rung, by forms unseen their dirges sung. Their honour comes, a pilgrim grey, to watch the turf that wraps their clay, and freedom shall awhile repair to dwell a weeping hermit there." Thus the boy patriot did what he could, and when he grew up he served his country so well in many important matters that he was called to her highest office and became the 6th President of the United States. How shall the stars be placed? On that great day when the Congress of the United States adopted the Stars and Stripes as our national flag, it resolved that the Union should be 13 stars, white in a blue field, representing a new constellation. And a new constellation it was. 13 stars of the 13 states united as one, a constellation destined to shine on all the world, liberty enlightening the world. But how should the stars be grouped upon the flag? That was the question. John Adams suggested that they should be arranged in the form of the constellation Lyra, the beautiful cluster of stars shining in our northern night. But the new constellation of American stars could not be arranged thus to look well. So it was decided to place them in a circle, for a circle has no end, and it was hoped that as the country grew larger, adding more states and a new star for each state, that the circle would widen. and it has widened and widened, until there is no longer any room for a circle on our flag, but spangled like the sky at night, it has become the Star-Spangled Banner. The Mysterious Stranger. A mysterious foreign stranger suddenly appeared in New York City after John Adams had retired from the presidency. He was handsome, with beaming hazel eyes and flashing white teeth. He was graceful, with courtly manners. He called himself George Martin. But what his real name was, or what his mysterious purpose was, only a few people knew. He was dined and toasted by New York officials. He went to the city of Washington on his secret mission. He was granted private interviews by the President and the Secretary of State. He talked much about his friends Catherine the Great of Russia and William Pitt of England. He seemed to know the secret plots and political intrigues of Europe. Then he vanished as mysteriously as he had come. A few weeks later, John Adams heard the astounding news. The stranger was no other than the celebrated South American patriot, Don Francisco de Miranda. He had sailed away secretly from New York in a little ship laden with arms and ammunition, and, what was worse, he had taken with him a band of young American men, some of them mere boys, and he was sailing toward the Spanish Main with the intention of freeing South America from Spanish rule. He had taken with him young William Steuben Smith, John Adams's grandson. Young Smith was a college boy, very bright and courageous, and thirsty for adventure. "What do you think were my sensations and reflections?" wrote John Adams to a friend. "I shudder to this moment at the recollection of them. I saw the ruin of my only daughter and her good-hearted, enthusiastic husband, and had no other hope or wish or prayer than that the ship, with my grandson in it, might be sunk in a storm in the Gulf Stream." For young William Steuben Smith's father was surveyor of the port of New York, and had allowed Miranda's ship to clear with arms and ammunition in its hold, to be used against Spain, with whom we were at peace. Then came to John Adams the terrible news that Spanish armed vessels had captured some of the American boys. His grandson had been captured and thrown into a dungeon in a dark, filthy fortress in Venezuela. He was to be tried as a pirate taken on the high seas, and without doubt he would be hanged. The Spanish ambassador, who had known John Adams in Europe, hastened to offer his services. He would intercede with Spain for the grandson, he said. No, said John Adams to a friend, he should share the fate of his colleagues, comrades, and fellow prisoners. But happily it was all a great mistake. Young Smith was not hanged as a pirate. He had not been captured at all. Instead, he was sailing gaily on in Miranda's mystery ship. He had been made aide-de-camp and lieutenant colonel, and had donned Miranda's brilliant uniform. For the story of what happened further to the mystery ship, see page 335. His last toast. It was the last day of June, 1826. In 5 days it would be the 4th of July, the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. John Adams had been one of the committee to frame the Declaration. A neighbor was sitting with John Adams in his home in Quincy, that used to be Braintree. 91 years old was John Adams. The neighbor was to be orator at the annual banquet on the 4th of July. He had called to ask John Adams to compose the toast. "Independence forever," said John Adams. But would he not wish to add something further to the toast? Asked the neighbor. "Not a word," replied John Adams. The 4th of July dawned. The great patriot lay dying. At the setting of the sun, those who stood beside him heard him whisper, "Thomas Jefferson still lives." As the sun sank out of sight, a loud cheering came from the village. It was the shouts of the people at the words of his toast, "Independence forever." The cheering echoed through the room where John Adams was. But before its last sounds could die away, the great patriot had passed into history and eternity on the 4th of July, on the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Good Stories for Great Birthdays. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Good Stories for Great Birthdays by Francis Jenkins Olcott. November the 15th. William Pitt, Defender of America. The colonists are equally entitled with yourselves to all the natural rights of mankind and the peculiar privileges of Englishmen. William Pitt. He at once breathed his own lofty spirit into the country he served, as he communicated something of his own grandeur to the men who served him. No man, said a soldier of the time, ever entered Mr. Pitt's closet who did not feel himself braver when he came out than when he went in. John Richard Green. He stands in the annals of Europe, an illustrious and venerable name, admired by countrymen and strangers, by all to whom loftiness of moral principle and greatness of talent are objects of regard. Thomas Carlyle. William Pitt was born in England, November the 15th, 1708. He was created Earl of Chatham, 1766. He died May the 11th, 1778. He was known as the Great Commoner while in the House of Commons, as Chatham after he entered the House of Lords, and as the elder Pitt, to distinguish him from his son, William Pitt, called the younger, who likewise was a great statesman. There are American towns and cities named in honor of William Pitt, our defender, among them Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Chatham, New York, and Pittsfield, Massachusetts. This terrible cornet of horse. In the hilt of Napoleon's ceremonial sword was set a huge diamond, one of the largest in the world. It had been brought from India by Diamond Pitt of England, who had sold it to the Regent of France. Diamond Pitt was Thomas Pitt, an adventurous young sailor. He had gone to India and had started in business for himself as a trader. The British East India Company claimed the monopoly of trade in India, when the bold young Englishman, without so much as a by your leave, started an opposition business. The company determined to crush him. It set its powerful legal machinery to work, but it was one thing to try and crush Thomas Pitt, and quite another thing to do it. He fought desperately for his rights. Though he was arrested and fined, he still kept on trading, in defiance of the company. He battled so successfully, and for so many years, that at last for its own protection the company was forced to take him into its service. He rose to be governor of Madras. He became known as Diamond Pitt because he was always in search of large diamonds. Thus he procured the famous Pitt diamond, which found its way into Napoleon's sword. With a part of the fortune which Diamond Pitt got from its sale, he bought an estate in England. Later he became a member of Parliament. Diamond Pitt's grandson, William Pitt, was not a strong boy. He spent much time with his books. He liked to read Shakespeare aloud to the family. He enjoyed reading The Faerie Queen, in which the Red Cross Knight, fearless of harm or evil thing, rides about rescuing the innocent and helpless. Though he was not strong in body, William Pitt had an iron will. He had Diamond Pitt's indomitable courage, and the fighting qualities with which the sailor had matched his strength against that of the powerful East India Company. William Pitt attended Oxford University. When he was 23, he was commissioned Cornet of Horse in the King's Blues. The fearless Cornet of Horse was soon elected to the House of Commons. He started his political career at the House with a fiery, sarcastic speech supporting the Prince of Wales, who was at enmity with the king his father. William Pitt was a born orator. He was tall, elegant, and graceful. His eyes were bright and piercing. He spoke with dignified gesture, and he delivered this speech with such strength, magnetism, and irony that the Prime Minister exclaimed, "We must muzzle this terrible Cornet of Horse." To muzzle him he tried, at first, with promises of reward. But William Pitt was incorruptible. He would not sell his honour. Then influence was brought to bear, and the young Cornet of Horse was dismissed from the army. But this very act, by which his enemies planned to muzzle William Pitt, brought him before the public eye. His fearlessness and remarkable oratory advanced him daily with both Parliament and people. In time, William Pitt became a leading power, at first in the House of Commons, and afterward, when he was created Earl of Chatham, in the House of Lords. He served twice as Prime Minister of England, and he laid the solid foundations of the British colonial empire. But more than all else, he was an Englishman defending the unalienable rights of all Englishmen. He steadfastly combated those political evils in the British government which, at that time, were threatening to undermine English liberty as set down in the Magna Carta and safeguarded by the English Constitution. The Charter of Liberty. The signing of the Magna Carta, 1215. O thou that sendest out the man to rule by land and sea, strong mother of a lion line, be proud of those strong sons of thine, who wrench their rights from thee. What wonder if in noble heat those men thine arms withstood, retaught the lesson thou hadst taught, and in thy spirit with thee fought, who sprang from English blood. Alfred Tennyson, condensed. Magna Carta, the great charter of the liberties of Englishmen. At Runnymede, the freemen of England, through the action of their barons, forced King John to sign and seal the Magna Carta. His tyrannous power was torn from him. He was forced to pledge himself to violate no longer the rights and privileges of English freemen. For, from times remote, human rights and liberties, protecting them from oppression by rulers, had been theirs by laws and by common consent. About 100 years after the signing of the Magna Carta, the great principle that English freemen should not be taxed without representation was established. When King Charles I broke his promises to respect the rights of his subjects, he was tried and executed. When King James II governed in despotic manner, exercising what he believed to be the divine right of kings, he lost his throne. What has this to do with America and William Pitt? Everything. During the reigns of the Stuart kings, large sections of America were explored and settled by English freemen, who came to America to escape persecution, and to enjoy English liberty, which at that time they could not possibly have had in England. The Stuart kings believed in divine right, which means that the king is the Lord's anointed, and that neither Parliament nor people may question any of his acts, and that no matter how cruel or tyrannous a king may be, the people must submissively obey him. The Magna Carta and the English Constitution protect the English people against this doctrine of divine right. So when, during the reign of these kings, men and women fled from England to find liberty and refuge in America, they brought with them their ancient institutions, the rights and privileges guaranteed them under the Magna Carta. There were other Englishmen equally courageous, equally liberty-loving, who came to seek their fortunes and build homes in the New World. They, too, brought with them their rights and privileges. These English pioneers hewed their way through the savage wilderness. Many of them were massacred by red men, while their homes were burned. Some of them were carried into captivity and tortured. Yet the great body of undaunted English settlers resolutely kept on pushing their frontiers westward. They laid out farms and plantations. They built villages and towns. They founded churches and schools. They obtained charters from far-away England, confirming their rights. And through God's blessing they prospered and became strong and rich. Other liberty-loving folk, the Dutch, settled in great numbers in what is now New York and New Jersey, while many settlers from different parts of Europe came to the New World to build homes for themselves and their children. The very air of America breathed freedom. The magnitude of the country and the difficulties of pioneer life helped to invigorate, expand, and make indomitable those ideals of English liberty which the first settlers and frontiersmen had brought with them. When King George III inherited the British crown, he was unable to understand the free spirit of Englishmen, and he was far from realizing its tremendous growth in the New World. He taxed the Americans without representation. He placed a standing army in the colonies without their consent. He blockaded the port of Boston to force her to submit to his unjust laws. In some cases, trial by jury was abolished. These are some of his tyrannous violations of the rights and privileges of English free men. The people of America, in indignation, petitioned the king for redress. There was no redress. So the people of America rose in arms, and, in the true spirit of Magna Carta, they issued the Declaration of Independence. Now we shall see what William Pitt had to do with all this. America's Defender. For the defence of liberty, upon a general principle, upon a constitutional principle, it is a ground on which I stand firm, on which I dare meet any man. This country had no right under heaven to tax America. It is contrary to all the principles of justice and civil policy. If I were an American, he exclaimed, as I am an Englishman, while a foreign troop has landed in my country, I would never lay down my arms. Never, never, never. William Pitt, Earl of Chatham. It was natural that an English statesman who sincerely and firmly believed in the rights of all Englishmen should become the defender of America, and her loyal friend and champion was William Pitt. By the weight of his eloquent speeches he fought her battles in Parliament. When the Stamp Act was passed, he was absent from his place in Parliament because of illness, but later he was present. Leaning on his crutch, for he was still very sick, he indignantly arraigned the British ministry which had brought about the passage of the Act. Quote, "When the resolution was taken in this House to tax America," he said, "I was ill in bed. If I could have endured to have been carried in my bed, so great was the agitation of my mind for the consequences, I would have solicited some kind hand to have laid me down on this floor, to have borne my testimony against it. The colonists are the subject of this kingdom, equally entitled with yourselves to all the natural rights of mankind and the peculiar privileges of Englishmen, equally bound by its laws, and equally participating in the constitution of this free country. The Americans are the sons of England." End quote. And when one of the members made a speech abusing the Americans, defending the Stamp Act, and accusing Pitt of sowing sedition among the American colonists, he rose and answered, quote, "The gentleman tells us," he said, "America is obstinate. America is almost in open rebellion. I rejoice that America has resisted. 3 millions of people so dead to all the feelings of liberty as voluntarily to let themselves be made slaves would have been fit instruments to make slaves of all the rest. In a good cause, on a sound bottom, the force of this country can crush America to atoms. I know the valor of your troops. I know the skill of your officers. But on this ground, on the Stamp Act, when so many here will think it a crying injustice, I am one who will lift up my hands against it. In such a cause, even your success would be hazardous. America, if she fell, would fall like the strong man. She would embrace the pillars of the state, and pull down the Constitution along with her. Is this your boasted peace? To sheathe the sword, not in its scabbard, but in the bowels of your countrymen? Upon the whole, I will beg leave to tell the House what is really my opinion. It is that the Stamp Act be repealed absolutely, totally, and immediately." End quote. And whether the Stamp Act was repealed absolutely, totally, and immediately, John Fiske tells in his thrilling history, The American Revolution. The Sons of Liberty. William Pitt was not the only English statesman who championed America. There was Lord Rockingham, at one time Prime Minister of England, also the Earl of Camden, and the celebrated Charles James Fox. And there was Edmund Burke, one of the earliest friends of America, with his scratch wig, round spectacles, and pockets stuffed with papers. He pleaded our cause so brilliantly that his hearers were dazzled by his oratory, with its passionate ardour, its poetic fancy, its amazing prodigality of resources, the dazzling succession in which irony, pathos, invective, tenderness, the most brilliant word pictures, the coolest arguments, followed each other. And among America's British friends was Colonel Barré, a member of the House of Commons. In an indignant speech against the Stamp Act, he referred to the American patriots as Sons of Liberty. When his speech reached America, the name Sons of Liberty was adopted by secret societies pledged to resist the Stamp Act. In Boston, the Sons of Liberty held meetings under the Liberty Tree, a huge elm. They also met in Faneuil Hall, since called the cradle of American liberty. In New York City, the Sons of Liberty erected a tall Liberty pole and defended it against the Redcoats. All over the country, the Sons of Liberty were active, sometimes too violently so, in the cause of American independence. A last scene. In 1778 a dramatic event took place in the House of Lords. William Pitt, old now and wasted by disease, but the fire of whose genius still burned bright and clear, was about to speak. France had acknowledged the independence of the United States. Germany was planning to do so, while Spain stood ready to enter into an alliance with the Americans. England was at war with France. The situation of England seemed desperate. And on that dramatic day in the House of Lords, the Duke of Richmond was about to move that the royal fleets and armies should be instantly withdrawn from America, and peace be made on whatever terms Congress might see fit to accept. But William Pitt would not willingly consent to a step that seemed certain to wreck the empire his genius had won for England. He had got up from his sick bed and had come to the House of Lords to argue against the motion. Wrapped in flannel bandages, and leaning upon crutches, his dark eyes in their brilliancy enhancing the pallor of his careworn face, as he entered the House, supported on one side by his son-in-law, and on the other by that younger son who was soon to add fresh glory to the name of William Pitt, the peers all started to their feet and remained standing until he had taken his place. In broken sentences, with strange flashes of the eloquence which had once held captive ear and heart, he protested against the hasty adoption of a measure which simply prostrated the dignity of England before its ancient enemy, the House of Bourbon. The Duke of Richmond's answer, reverently and delicately worded, urged that while the magic of Chatham's name could work anything short of miracles, yet only a miracle could now relieve them from the dire necessity of abandoning America. Chatham rose to reply, but his overwrought frame gave way, and he sank in a swoon upon the floor. All business was at once adjourned. The peers, with eager sympathy, came crowding up to offer assistance, and the unconscious statesman was carried in the arms of his friends to a house near by, whence, in a few days, he was removed to his home. There, after lingering between life and death for several weeks, on the 11th of May, and in the 70th year of his age, Lord Chatham breathed his last. The man thus struck down like a soldier at his post was one whom Americans, no less than Englishmen, have delighted to honour. John Fiske, retold. End of chapter 5.
Chapter 6 of Good Stories for Great Birthdays. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Brianna. Good Stories for Great Birthdays by Francis Jenkins Olcott. December the 2nd. Dom Pedro II, the magnanimous, the best republican in Brazil. To Thy Majesty Dom Pedro II, Emperor of Brazil, scholar and scientist, patron of arts and letters, sterling statesman and model monarch, whose reign of half-century has been zealously and successfully devoted to public instruction, industrial enterprise, and the abolition of slavery throughout the vast and opulent empire of the Southern Cross. Dedication by Frank Vincent. Freedom in Brazil. With clearer light, cross of south shine forth in blue Brazilian skies. And thou, O river, cleaving half the earth from sunset to sunrise, from the great mountains to the Atlantic waves, thy joys long anthem pour. Yet a few years, God make them less, and slaves shall shame thy pride no more. No feathered feet thy shaded margins press, but all men shall walk free, where thou, the high priest of the wilderness, hast wedded sea to sea. And thou, great-hearted ruler, through whose mouth the word of God is said, once more, let there be light, Son of the South, lift up thy honored head, wear unashamed a crown by thy desert, more than by birth thy own, careless of watch and ward, thou art begirt by grateful hearts alone. The moated wall and battleship may fail, but safe shall justice prove, stronger than greaves of brass or iron mail, the panoply of love. John Greenleaf Whittier, condensed. Dom Pedro was born December 2nd, 1825. Was made emperor at 5 years of age, April 7th, 1831. Visited the United States in 1876. His daughter, Princess Isabel, emancipated the slaves 1888. He abdicated and Brazil was proclaimed a republic in 1889. Dom Pedro died December 5th, 1891. The Brazils Magnificent. Robinson Crusoe, after escaping from Moorish slavery with the boy Xury, was rescued by a Portuguese ship bound for South America. He was carried by the ship's captain to the Brazils. There he settled, bought a plantation, and made a fortune. Then away from those same Brazils he sailed and was wrecked and cast upon his desert island. Magnificent and rich were Robinson Crusoe's Brazils, or the country of Brazil, stretching vast and unknown far westward into the interior of the continent. Near the sea coast and in the parts inhabited by civilized men were plantations of coffee, tobacco, and fruits. Primeval forests covered the shores of the rivers whose mighty water rushed far out into the ocean. Fierce savages ruled the forests. There were gold, spices, and diamonds in Robinson Crusoe's Brazil, and rare woods, brilliant birds, butterflies, and flowers. And so is the country of Brazil today, a magnificent land. Only there are cities there now, and towns and villages. And today Brazil is a republic with a constitution like of our own United States. In Robinson Crusoe's time, Brazil was owned and ruled by the Kingdom of Portugal, just as other parts of South America were owned and ruled by the Crown of Spain. How Brazil won independence and became a republic is a fascinating story. The Empire of the Southern Cross. Brazil, on which the Southern Cross of 4 bright stars looks down, first became a kingdom, then an empire, and after a republic. When Napoleon's army threatened to invade Portugal, the royal family of Portugal fled in terror of their lives. They escaped from Lisbon, crossed the Atlantic, and found refuge in the royal colony of Brazil. In 1815 Brazil was declared a kingdom, though still to remain a part of Portugal, the first and only European kingdom in America. When the time arrived that the royal family might safely return to Portugal, the king left his son, Dom Pedro, to be regent or governor of Brazil. but the Brazilians had grown used to having their king live among them. More just laws and greater privileges were theirs when their ruler lived in the land. He could understand their needs better than if he ruled them from Europe. So the Brazilians became dissatisfied when their country was reduced once more to the state of a colony. Dom Pedro was a patriotic Brazilian and ruled the country without much regard to Portugal's wishes. Trouble soon arose between the mother country and Brazil. Dom Pedro proclaimed the independence of Brazil September 7, 1822. An empire was established, and Dom Pedro was made emperor under a constitution. But as time went on, the emperor did not uphold the people's rights, so he was forced to abdicate in favor of his little son, Dom Pedro, who was only 5 years old. After which Dom Pedro I sailed away to Europe, leaving little Dom Pedro II to rule in his stead, making the little emperor. "The king is afloat! God save the king!" were the shouts which rang through the streets of Rio de Janeiro, for now their emperor, Pedro I, had abdicated and escaped on an English man-of-war. The people were giving themselves up to rejoicing. "The king is afloat! God save the king!" was the cry of the townspeople, and the streets, festooned with coffee branches, were made to glow with coloured silks, while the balconies were thronged with señoritas in all their finery of brilliant dresses, garlands, fluttering fans, and feather flowers. They were witnessing the triumphal entry into his capital of the new emperor, Dom Pedro II, the little lad of 5½ years old. First in the procession of the city emperor were justices of peace bearing green flags. Then came the little emperor. And what a figure was this! A tiny infant in a huge state coach, dragged by 4 strings of excited mulattoes. He cried, and at the same time waved a white handkerchief. The tender-hearted Brazilians, every man and woman of their number a child or daughter, were altogether overcome by the sight, and even the choir that accompanied the procession was touched. Its triumphant chant died away in an emotional quiver. With great pomp, little Pedro was installed as emperor, the eyes of the enthusiastic spectators swimming with tears as he was carried out the chapel in the arms of an old chamberlain. Later, while sitting in a little chair at the window of the palace, he reviewed the troops of his empire. But though little Pedro was now emperor of all Brazil, he was too young to rule. A regent ruled for him for 10 years, while Pedro studied and prepared himself to govern his people. W. H. Cabell and Other Sources. The Patriot Emperor. Viva Dom Pedro II! At last a large political party in the capital grew tired of installing regents and electing new ministers, and insistently demanded that the emperor himself begin to reign, although legally he was still too young. According to the constitution, an emperor reached his majority at the age of 18, and Dom Pedro was only 15. But in spite of his youth, Dom Pedro II was declared constitutional emperor and perpetual defender of Brazil. Viva Dom Pedro II! So mature was the young emperor in mind and appearance that he was well fitted to play the part of an 18-year-old. His tutors were the best that could be found in Europe or South America, and he was a brilliant student. He had a trick of relighting his lamp at night and studying for a while after every one had gone to bed. Natural history, mathematics, astronomy were his favorite subjects at that time. But in the course of his life he studied almost everything under the sun, and he could talk fluently on any subject in English, German, French, Italian, or Spanish. He read Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. When he was 60, he learned Sanskrit. His library was packed with histories, biographies, encyclopedias, and law books. Besides his library, the Emperor loved peace, happiness, and prosperity. These were his gifts to Brazil during his long reign, while surrounding nations were struggling with anarchy and civil war. Before Dom Pedro was 18, he signed a contract of marriage with a princess whom he had never seen, Teresa Cristina Maria, sister of the King of the Two Sicilies. A Brazilian squadron conducted her to Rio, and the city received her with splendid ceremonies. My people. Under Dom Pedro's guiding influence, Brazil gained steadily in power, importance, and reputation. Home industries and foreign commerce doubled. Telegraphic communications were established with the United States and Europe. Good steamship lines, both coastwise and oceanic, made Brazil accessible to all the world. Public property was open to settlements, and the government became as hospitable to all foreign enterprise as it had before this been exclusive. Above all things, Dom Pedro wanted to stimulate the love of knowledge among his people, to give the boys and girls of every class an equal chance. Free public schools were established all over the empire. One time the emperor learned that 3,000,000 francs had been pledged by citizens for a fine bronze statue of himself to be given the place of honor in a city square. Dom Pedro, expressing his deep gratitude, said that it would please him far more if the money could be used for public schools instead. The great and high school buildings of Rio have always been noted for their beauty, size, and equipment. While so many of the South American states were lagging far behind the times, Brazil under Dom Pedro caught up with other progressive nations of the world. Liberty of speech and religious tolerance were not even questioned, but taken for granted. Emancipating the Slaves, 1888. The greatest national event during Dom Pedro's reign was the abolition of slavery, and no one worked harder to bring it to pass than the Emperor himself. The African slave trade had been abolished in 1850, and from that time on public opinion grew more and more in favor of emancipation, in spite of the strong opposition of planters and wealthy slave owners. Following Dom Pedro's example, many high-minded citizens freed their own slaves. The slave was enabled to free himself in many ways, such as raising his own purchase money. The incentive to do this was great, for an ambitious slave had plenty of chance to rise in the world. Dom Pedro's dearest wish was that he might live to see every slave in the country a free man, and this wish came true in the last year of his reign. He had gone abroad in poor health, leaving his daughter Isabel as regent. When Congress met, the Princess Isabel railroaded the abolition bill through both houses in 8 days, and signed the bill which put the law into immediate effect. The empire of Southern Cross no more. Soon after the human Princess Isabel had freed the slaves, Dom Pedro came hastening from home from Europe. He landed in Rio and was received with genuine enthusiasm. But his loved personality could no longer stand between the throne and the widespread desire for a republic, together with the popular discontent aroused by Princess's acts. In 1889 a republican revolt took the whole empire by surprise. It had long been brewing beneath the surface, but so great was the emperor's popularity that republicans had tacitly agreed to postpone the new government until his death. A rumour that Dom Pedro might abdicate in favour of Princess Isabel, and thus initiate another generation of monarchy, precipitated the revolution. The republican leagues, with the backing of army and navy, refused to wait any longer. Dom Pedro, summoned from Petropolis by telegram, found a provisional government already organized when he reached the capital. In the imperial palace at Rio, surrounded by insurgents, the old emperor was told briefly that his long reign was over. "We are forced to notify you," said the ultimatum, "that the provisional government expects from your patriotism the sacrifice of leaving Brazilian territory with your family in the shortest possible time." Dom Pedro II replied simply, "I resolve to submit to the command of circumstances, and will depart with my family for Europe tomorrow, leaving this beloved country, to which I have tried to give firm testimony of my love and my dedication during nearly half a century as a chief of state. I shall always have kind remembrances of Brazil, and hopes for its prosperity." The next day the imperial family sailed for Lisbon. In 3 days' time a monarchy had been overthrown without bloodshed or opposition. The emperor, who had sometimes been called the best republican in Brazil, was replaced by a military dictator. The homesick emperor, living in European hotels or rented villas, always remained as one on the point of departure, as if he ever expected to be recalled by his former subjects, a hope which till the last moment would not die out of his heart. Margaret Daniels arranged. The United States of Brazil. Brazil, whose name originally meant the land of red dye wood, is today the United States of Brazil, with a constitution like our own. It has a president, vice president, and House of Congress, and an army and a navy. It has railroads, beautiful cities, many towns, and a world commerce. Brazil exports quantities of rubber, sugar, coffee, and other products. The milky juice of caoutchouc or rubber is gathered largely from the wild rubber trees growing in the tropical forests far in the interior of Brazil or along the banks of the Amazon. Our United States receives great shipments of this rubber. The coffee trees flourish in the famous red earth of Brazil, producing large crops of the delicious berry, to make happy the breakfast tables of the world. There is the friendliest of relations between our United States and Brazil. It is no uncommon sight to meet Brazilian sailors in their picturesque uniform at home on the streets of New York City. And when the statue of Bolivar, the liberator of Venezuela, was unveiled in Central Park in 1921, there was present a detachment of Brazilian Marines detailed from their battleship anchored in New York Harbor. They made an imposing appearance, filing down the park slope of Bolivar Hill in the military procession which accompanied President Harding. The year 1922, the 100th anniversary of Brazilian independence, has been celebrated by people of the United States. Out of friendship for Brazil, they have presented her with a statue of Liberty cast in bronze. Liberty holds aloft two entwined banners, the Brazilian flag and the Stars and Stripes. The Brazilian government has selected one of the most prominent spots in the city of Rio de Janeiro as a site for the statue. End of chapter 6. Recording by Brianna.
Chapter number 7 of Good Stories for Great Birthdays. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. Good Stories for Great Birthdays by Frances Jenkins Olcott. December 20th, William Bradford and the Landing of the Pilgrims. The word of God to Leyden came, Dutch town by Zuider Zee. Rise up, my children of no name, my kings and priests to be. There is an empire in the west, which I will soon unfold. 1,000 harvests in her breast, rocks ribbed with iron and gold. They left the towers of Leyden town, they left the Zuider Zee, and where they cast their anchor down, rose freedom's realm to be. J. E. Rankin. The Pilgrim Fathers. So they left that goodly and pleasant city, which had been their resting place near 12 years. But they knew they were pilgrims, and looked not much on these things, but lift up their eyes to the heavens, their dearest country, and quieted their spirits. Governor William Bradford. William Bradford was born about 1590. The Mayflower reached Cape Cod. Mayflower Compact signed November 11th, 1620. The Pilgrims landed on Plymouth Rock, probably December 20th, 1620. William Bradford died May 9th, 1657. The father of the New England colonies. William Bradford's birthday we celebrate on the anniversary of the landing of the Pilgrims on Plymouth Rock. We do not know the exact date of his birth. He was just an ordinary boy living in a small English village. He was brought up by relatives, for his father and mother had died when he was a child. They had left him a small fortune, so he was not in want. When about 12 years old, he began to read the Bible. It interested him so much that when older he attended the meetings of some neighbors who were studying the Bible and worshiping God in their own little assembly. Separatists, they were called, for they had separated from the established Church of England. In those days, it was a crime in England for anyone to hold or attend religious meetings of separatists. The Bible printed in the English tongue had long been forbidden reading, but in William Bradford's days it was beginning to be read quite widely, especially by separatists. These poor people's assemblies were watched by spies and informers. Separatists were arrested and imprisoned, while some were executed. Others fled into Holland, brave liberty-loving Holland, where there was no persecution for religion's sake. William Bradford became a separatist. When about 18 years old he, too, fled into Holland, where he might serve his Lord and Saviour, Jesus Christ, in full liberty of conscience. For 10 years or more he lived in Holland. He was a member of an English separatist church in Leyden, under the gentle rule of its beloved pastor John Robinson. The separatists believed that every man in the church congregation should have a voice in its management. Thus they elected their pastor. The time came when a part of Pastor Robinson's congregation decided to emigrate and seek a home in the New World. The leaders of this little band of pilgrims, the Pilgrim Fathers we call them, was William Bradford, John Carver, and Edward Winslow. With them went William Brewster, who was to be their pastor in the New World. Miles Standish also went with them and became the captain of their small army, which defended them against the Indians. So the Pilgrim Fathers, together with their wives, little ones, and men and maid servants, said farewell to Holland's hospitable shore. Soon after they sailed from England in the Mayflower, to found a settlement in the savage New World, under the rule of England. They took with them the seeds of American independence. They had left England so that they might have the freedom which was theirs by rights. They were come to America so that they might govern themselves, every man having a voice in the government of the new settlement, as well as in the management of his own congregation. This principle of self-government the Pilgrims embodied in their famous Mayflower Compact, an agreement which they drew up and signed the day they reached New England. Meanwhile, far to the south of New England, another colony of Englishmen had planted and was fostering other seeds of American independence. But let us see what became of William Bradford, since we are celebrating his birthday. We will let Cotton Mather tell it in his own quaint style. The rest of his days were spent in the services and the temptations of that American wilderness. Here was Master Bradford, in the year 1621, unanimously chosen the governor of the plantation, the difficulties whereof were such that if he had not been a person of more than ordinary piety, wisdom, and courage, he must have sunk under them. He served for 37 years, in every one of which he was chosen the governor, except 3 years wherein Master Winslow, and the 2 years wherein Master Prince, at the choice of the people, took a turn with him. But the crown of all was his holy, prayerful, watchful, and fruitful walk with God. He died May 9th, 1657, in the 69th year of his age, lamented by all the colonies of New England as a common blessing and father to them all. The Savage New World. It was November 1620. The ocean swelled angrily. A cold wind was blowing. As day broke over the gray water, seagulls swooped and wheeled around the good ship Mayflower, which, with tattered sails, was driving through the billows. For over 2 months she had been on her way from Plymouth, England, carrying the Pilgrims. And now, while the dull day was breaking suddenly, a cry was heard, "Land ho!" The Pilgrims came crowding to the deck, fathers, mothers, children, men and maid servants. They looked eagerly towards the west. They saw the coast of the New World. As the ship rushed nearer, low with a white line of surf beating against its wooden shore. It was a very new, strange, savage world awaiting them, full of unknown horrors and Indians. Yet the Pilgrims were not fearful. Had they not committed themselves to God's will? And was not this to be their home, the land to which He was bringing them? So they fell on their knees and blessed Him who had guided them safely through storm and stress. The wide bay where they first anchored, Cape Cod Bay, was wooded to the water's edge with pines and oaks, with sassafras and juniper, with birch and holly, ash and walnut. Whales swam spouting around the ship, while flocks of wild fowl flew screaming overhead. And when at last the Pilgrims went ashore in the uninhabited spot, how briskly the mothers and sisters rubbed and scrubbed! As they washed, the Pilgrim's clothes, for it had been a frightful 2 months' voyage, with so many storms and so much sickness aboard that little washing had been done. And the first thing the Pilgrim mothers did was to hold a great wash day. And while the women washed, the carpenter repaired the ship's shallop. For William Bradford and some of the others wished to explore the coast, and in order to find a safe and pleasant spot for their settlement. While the shallop was being got ready, the Pilgrims decided to send out a party by land, to see what the country was like. And many thrilling adventures the Pilgrim Fathers had before they discovered a site and built Plymouth town. On their first adventure, they saw Indians in the distance. They walked through fields of corn stubble, which belonged to Indians. They found a white man's cattle and the ruins of a cabin. They dug up a fine, great, new basket filled with corn, red, yellow, and blue. They took the corn with them, intending to search out the owner and pay him well. On the second adventure, they found empty Indian wigwams, more corn, and the grave of a man with yellow hair. On the third adventure, they left their shallop at night to camp on shore. In the gray dusk of morning, a band of fierce Nauset Indians attacked them. A fight of brass-headed or claw-tipped arrows came flying across the Pilgrims' barricade. The Pilgrims fired their guns, and the Nausets, whooping loudly, bounded away into the dusk. The Pilgrims pursued them for a short distance. Though many arrows had fallen around them, none of the Pilgrims were hurt. They gave thanks to God for their deliverance, and, after naming the spot the place of the first encounter, they sailed away in their shallop to explore the coast nearby. Then at last they discovered a beautiful site for their town, situated on a fine harbor. They returned to the Mayflower with the good news, and a few days before Christmas the Mayflower anchored in the harbor, and the Pilgrim folk landed on Plymouth Rock. On Christmas Day they began to build Plymouth town. Welcome, Englishmen! Welcome! That cry, just one English word, sounded through the street of Plymouth and startled the Pilgrims. They caught up their muskets and ran from the houses. A tall, naked savage, his lank hair clinging to his shoulders, was stalking along the street, holding a bow and arrow. "Welcome!" he shouted. The Pilgrims returned his greeting. He was Samoset, chief of Pemaquid, he told them. He had journeyed from very far off. He had learned English among the Englishmen who sometimes came to fish off the coast of his country. The Pilgrims, glad to talk with a friendly Indian, invited him to eat with them. Then, as the wind was rising, they wrapped a warm coat around his naked body. They gave him biscuit with butter and cheese, and a piece of cooked duck, all of which he seemed to relish hugely. And in answer to their questions, Samoset told them many things about the country. As for the Nauset Indians, who had attacked them so fiercely at the place of the first encounter, he said that these Nausets hated all white men, because a certain Englishman, one Captain Hunt, a short time before the Pilgrims landed, had cruelly deceived the Nauset Indians, kidnapping 20 of them and selling them to other white men. All this and much more, Samoset told the Pilgrims. He stayed with them that night. The next day they sent him away with a gift of a knife, a ring, and a bracelet. He went off promising that he would come soon again and bring other Indians to trade with them. But the Pilgrims were troubled, for they had not found the owners of the buried corn. Lost, lost, a boy! There were children on the Mayflower, Oceanus Hopkins, who was born at sea; Peregrine White, who gave his first baby cry soon after the Mayflower reached the New World; Francis Billington, who almost blew up the Mayflower while trying to make fireworks; and John Billington. John was a mischievous youngster, and so lively that the Pilgrim Fathers had to keep a stern eye upon him. But in spite of their watching, he got lost. For one day, soon after the Pilgrims were settled in Plymouth, he slipped out of the town, and into the woods that stretched farther than eye could see from the top of the highest tree. That night when John did not come home, the Plymouth folk were worried. Where was the boy? They asked. How had he managed to slip from the town without being seen? Had he strayed into the woods? Had a savage caught him and carried him off? Governor Bradford sent a party to look for him. They scoured the woods about, but there was no John. 5 days went by, 5 anxious days for the Plymouth folk, and John had not returned, when a message came from the friendly Indian, King Massasoit, saying that the Nausets had the lad. The Nauset Indians were the same fierce savages who had attacked the Pilgrims at the place of the first encounter. A shallop was launched and victualled, and the next morning 10 of the Pilgrims, with Sequantum, their Indian interpreter, set sail for Nauset. It was a dangerous trip. At first the day was calm and bright. Then came on a storm of wind with thunder and lightning that lashed the little ship, while a waterspout almost broke over her. But God be praised, said the Pilgrim Chronicle, which tells about the lost boy. God be praised! It dured not long, and we put in that night for harbor at a place called Cummiquid, where we had some hope to find the boy. But they did not find him there. The Nausets have got him, said the friendly Cummiquid Indians, when they came down the next morning to catch lobsters, and they invited the Pilgrims to come ashore and eat with them. So 6 of them landed, hoping to learn something more about John. Ivanhoe, the handsome young Cummaquid chief, welcomed them heartily. He made a feast of venison and maize cakes, and after they had eaten, he offered to go with them to help rescue John. So the Pilgrims put out to sea again, taking Ivanhoe and 2 of his braves. They made the best speed possible, for they were anxious to find what had happened to the boy. The tide was out when they reached Nauset, and the water was so shallow that they had to anchor at a distance from land. Ivanhoe, his braves, and Sequantum went ashore to find Aspinet, the Nauset chief. They hoped to persuade him to give up John, if he was still alive. Meanwhile, crowds of Nauset Indians came running down to the beach. They waded out from shore, and soon they were swimming around the shallop. The Pilgrims stood guard to keep them from boarding her, for they remembered all too well how these same savages had attacked them with showers of brass-headed arrows. Finally, they allowed 2 of the Indians to climb into the shallop, and what was the Pilgrims' delight when they found that one of the 2 was part owner of the corn dug up at Cornhill. They welcomed him gladly. They told him that they wished to pay for the corn. They asked him to come to Plymouth for the payment. He promised that he would. By this time the sun was setting, but Iyanough had not returned with news of John. This made the Pilgrims all more anxious. After sunset, they saw a long train of Nauset Indians come winding down to the beach. At their head walked the haughty chief Aspinet. He drew near the edge of the beach. Some of his warriors stood guard with their bows and arrows ready to shoot. The others laid down their weapons and followed Aspinet into the water. They began to wade out toward the shallop. And whom should the Pilgrims see sitting on the shoulders of a big Indian but John himself, covered with strings of beads! He had been visiting in the Nauset village, when his new friend the big Indian had feasted and entertained him in his wigwam. And while the Indian was giving John over to the Pilgrims, Aspinet announced that he and his people wished to make peace with the white man. So the Pilgrims made peace with him, and presented him with a strong English knife. They gave another one to the big Indian in return for his kindness to John. Aspinet and his warriors then went back friendly and satisfied to their village. So the lost boy was found, and so the buried corn was paid for at last. The Rattlesnake Challenge. It was just before Christmas, when a strange brave came into Plymouth town, carrying a bundle of new arrows wrapped in a rattlesnake skin. He asked for Simquantum. When they told him that Simquantum was away, he smiled and seemed glad. He laid down the skin, and turned to run out of the town. But Governor Bradford did not like his looks nor his queer gift, so ordered Captain Standish to seize him. The captain laid hold of him, and locked him up for the night. At first the poor Indian shook so with fear that he could not speak. Then as they questioned him gently he grew calmer, and when they promised to set him free if he would tell who had sent him, he confessed to being a messenger from Canonicus, the great chieftain of the Narragansett Indians, a people powerful and many thousands strong. Governor Bradford in the morning set him free, bidding him to go back to Canonicus and tell him that if he would not live at peace with white men, as their other Indian neighbors did, the white men would show him their wrath. The messenger listened quietly. He refused all offers of food, but thanked the Pilgrims for their kindness. Then he sped away to his master. When Simquantum came back, they asked him what the rattlesnake skin meant. To send a rattlesnake skin meant an enemy, he said. It was the same as sending a challenge. In answer, Governor Bradford stuffed the skin full of powder, and sent it back by an Indian runner to Canonicus. The runner delivered it with such terrifying words of defiance that Canonicus would not even touch it for fear of the powder and shot, nor would he let the rattlesnake skin stay overnight in his village. The runner refused to take it back to Plymouth. Canonicus then gave it to one of his own Indians, who had it posted from place to place, until at last it was returned to Governor Bradford unopened. The Great Drought. How the Pilgrims' little farms did flourish! Rye, barley, maize, oats, beans, and peas grew and thrived. Also parsnips, carrots, turnips, onions, melons, radishes, and beets. In the gardens were fragrant herbs. Refreshing watercresses grew wild in the meadows, while fruit ripened on the trees, which the Pilgrims had found already growing in the land. But early during the third summer destruction threatened those little farms. There was a great drought. For many weeks scarcely a drop of rain fell. The corn, oats, rye, and barley drooped their yellowing blades. The beans stopped running and lay parched and shriveling. The other vegetables were turning yellow. Unless rain should fall soon, the Pilgrims knew that they and their little children must starve when winter came. To add to the misery of it all, a ship laden with supplies, which had been sent from England, was missing. Nothing had been heard of her for months, and now, during the great drought, the wreck of a ship was cast on shore. In sorrow and anxiety the Pilgrims met together for a day of public fasting and prayer. We will let Edward Winslow himself tell what happened. But oh, the mercy of our God, who was as ready to hear as we to ask! For though in the morning when we assembled together, the heavens were as clear and the drought as like to continue as ever it was, yet our exercise, public worship, continuing some 8 or 9 hours, before our departure the weather was overcast, the clouds gathered together on all sides, and on the next morning distilled such soft, sweet, and moderate showers of rain, continuing some 14 days, and mixed with such seasonable weather, as it was hard to say whether our withered corn or drooping affections were most quickened or revived. Such was the bounty and goodness of our God. So that having these many signs of God's favor and acceptation, we thought it would be great ingratitude if secretly we should smother up the same, or content ourselves with private thanksgiving for that which by private prayer could not be obtained. And therefore another solemn day was set apart and appointed for that end, wherein we returned glory, honor, and praise, with all thankfulness to our good God, which dealt so graciously with us. Governor Edward Winslow, condensed. The story of the first harvest home in Plymouth may be found in Good Stories for Great Holidays. End of chapter 7. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC.
Chapter 8 of Good Stories for Great Birthdays. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Good Stories for Great Birthdays by Francis Jenkins Olcott. Chapter 8. January the 7th, General Israel Putnam, Old Put. The picturesque wolf slayer, a brave and sterling patriot. John Fiske. There was a generosity and buoyancy about the brave old man that made him a favourite throughout the army, especially with the younger officers, who spoke of him familiarly and fondly as Old Put. Washington Irving. General Israel Putnam was born in Massachusetts, January the 7th, 1718. He moved to Connecticut, 1740. He left his plough to fight at Bunker Hill, 1775. He died May the 29th, 1790. Seeing Boston. It was before the War of Independence. A country boy in rough homespun clothes was walking along the streets of Boston. He was staring at the shop signs and windows. It was his first visit to the big city. He had never seen such interesting things before. The boy was Israel Putnam, the son of a farmer. A city boy, much bigger than Putnam, saw him wandering about, staring curiously at everything. He thought that it would be safe to bully such a raw-looking boy. Stepping up to Putnam, he began to make fun of his coarse clothes and his awkward walk. Putnam stood it as long as he could, for though he was known as a fighter at home, he never provoked a quarrel. But now, as he saw a crowd gathering which seemed to enjoy his humiliation, his blood rose. He turned on the big boy and gave him such a drubbing that the crowd cheered with delight. The boy slunk off, and Putnam walked away and had no more annoyance. That was the kind of boy, and man too, Israel Putnam was, slow to anger, but when once roused by injustice, nothing could hold him back. The fight with the wolf. Israel Putnam grew older, married, and went to live in Connecticut. He had a stock farm. One winter, wolves began to kill his animals. There was a she-wolf, particularly fierce and ravenous, who had lost the toes of one foot. She attacked and devoured animals for miles around. During a single night, Putnam lost 70 fine sheep and goats, besides having many lambs and kids badly torn. In the morning he found around the fold the tracks of the she-wolf's toeless foot. Putnam and some of his neighbours traced her to a cave about 5 miles away. Then they returned home. The next morning they started out with dogs, guns, and brimstone. The dogs chased the wolf into her cave, but came running out again, torn and yelping. Putnam and the men built a fire in the cave entrance. They threw on brimstone, which gave out choking fumes. They threw on straw, which made a thick smoke. But there were no signs of the wolf. All was quiet in the cave. It grew to be nearly 10 o'clock at night. Putnam tried once more to make his dog enter the cave, but he would not stir. Putnam then asked his negro man to go in and shoot the beast, but the black man, shivering with fright, refused to crawl in. Putnam grew angry. In spite of all that his neighbours could say, he threw off his coat and lighted a torch. Then, tying a rope around his legs, he gave the end to his friends, saying when he signalled to pull him out. In he went, head first, holding the lighted torch before him. Stooping, he groped his way into the body of the cave. The torch made a dim circle of light. All the rest of the den was in terrifying darkness. Silence like death was around him. He cautiously proceeded onward to the ascent. As he was slowly climbing it on hands and knees, he discovered the glaring eyeballs of the she-wolf just in front of him. Startled at the sight of the flaming torch, she gnashed her teeth and gave a sullen growl. Putnam kicked the rope, and his friends, who were listening with painful anxiety, and who heard the growling of the beast, pulled him out so quickly that his shirt was stripped over his head and his body was badly cut. After he had adjusted his clothes, he loaded his gun with buckshot. Then, holding the torch in one hand and the gun in the other, he entered again. This time the wolf assumed a still more fierce and terrible aspect, howling, rolling her eyes, and snapping her teeth. Then she dropped her head between her legs, making ready to spring. At this moment Putnam raised his gun and fired. Stunned by the noise and suffocated with smoke, he felt himself being jerked backward out of the cave. His friends had heard the shot and were pulling the rope. He rested a few moments in the fresh air, while letting the smoke dissipate. Then in he went a third time. The wolf lay stretched on the floor as if asleep. He put the torch to her nose to make sure that she was dead. Then he took her by the ears and kicked the rope. His friends, with loud cheers, drew him out, and the wolf with him. From plough to camp. Israel Putnam did not stay on his farm. When the French and Indian War broke out, he enlisted. He served as major. He had many thrilling escapes from Indians. Once he was captured and tortured by savages, but was rescued by the French. After many years' service, he resigned and went back to his farm. When the news of the Battle of Lexington reached him, he was ploughing. He left his plough in the field and unyoked his team. Then, in his old farm clothes, he sprang on a horse and galloped off to Governor Trumbull for orders. "Go," said the governor, "to the seat of action." "But my clothes, governor!" exclaimed Putnam. "Oh, never mind your clothes," answered he. "Your military experience will be of service to your countrymen." "But my men, governor! What shall I do about my men?" "Oh, never mind your men," said he. "I'll send your men after you." So without waiting to change his soiled farm clothes, Putnam put spurs to his horse, and in a single day rode all the way to Cambridge. He attended a council of war held by the Americans, returned to Connecticut, raised a regiment, and went back to Cambridge in time to take part in the Battle of Bunker Hill. There on Prospect Hill he unfurled the new banner of Connecticut, which, as a cannon fired a salute, was seen to rise and unroll itself to the wind. When Washington, appointed by Congress to be commander-in-chief, arrived at Cambridge, he saw the redoubts that had been cast up by Putnam and his men. He said to Putnam, "You seem, General, to have the faculty of infusing your own spirit into all the workmen you employ." Washington had brought with him a commission from Congress, making Israel Putnam a major general. He made Washington laugh. General Putnam once had the honor of making Washington laugh heartily. It was during the siege of Boston. There was a traitor in camp. No one knew who he was. A strange woman, a spy, had delivered a letter intended for him to the wrong person. It was laid before Washington. It was in cipher. Washington ordered the woman to be arrested, but she was gone. Not long after, as Washington was standing in the upper window at headquarters, he saw the oddest sight. It was stout old Put himself, in all his regimentals, mounted on his horse, proudly cantering up to headquarters. Behind him, seated on his saddle-bow, and hanging on like grim death, was a very fat woman. Old Put had captured the spy. Washington burst into a hearty laugh. He hurried to the top of the stairs, just as old Put escorted the fat woman into the hall. Washington, as gravely as he could, called down in his severest tones that unless she confessed everything, a halter was waiting for her. She confessed immediately, and the traitor in camp was found. A generous foe. Israel Putnam was brave, bluff, and honest, and he was also compassionate. During the French and Indian War, the enemy's wounded lay dying and neglected on one of the battlefields. After the fierce fighting was over, Putnam himself hurried out onto the field to tend the poor fellows. He gathered them together into one place. He gave them what food and drink he could get. He furnished each with a blanket. Under one badly wounded French sergeant he placed 3 blankets and laid him in a comfortable position against a tree. Gratefully the suffering man squeezed his hand, while Putnam said reassuringly, "Ah, depend upon it, my brave soldier, you shall be brought to the camp as soon as possible, and the same care shall be taken of you as if you were my brother." At the Battle of Princeton, a Scotch captain of the British Army was desperately wounded in the lungs and left for dead. Putnam found him in great pain, with no surgeon, and without any friend to cheer him. He had him supplied with every comfort and the best of care. One day, when Putnam was visiting him, the Scotchman said, "Pray, sir, what countryman are you?" "An American," answered Putnam. "Not a Yankee!" exclaimed the Scotchman. "A full-blooded one," replied Putnam. "I'm sorry for that," rejoined the Scotchman with an oath. "I did not think there could be so much goodness and generosity in an American, or, indeed, in anybody but a Scotchman." Thanks to Putnam's friendly Yankee care, the Scotchman recovered. Putnam not forgotten. When General Putnam, full of years and honors, retired from the army, Washington wrote him a letter telling him that he was entitled to full pay till the close of the war, and afterwards to half pay. The letter was cordial and warm, and in it Washington said, "Among the many worthy and meritorious officers with whom I have had the happiness to be connected in service through the course of this war, and from whose cheerful assistance and advice I have received much support and confidence, the name of Putnam is not forgotten, nor will it be, but with that stroke of time which shall obliterate from my mind the remembrance of all those toils and fatigues through which we have struggled for the preservation and establishment of the rights, liberties, and independence of our country. I commend you, my dear sir, my other friends, and with them the interests and happiness of our dear country, to the keeping and protection of Almighty God. George Washington. End of chapter 8.